We know that climate change is having a massive impact on biodiversity around the world, but the second factor, and perhaps the biggest, is habitat destruction. So I've taken a quote from WWF on the page of Impact of Habitat Loss on Species. I've linked to it in extra resources if you want to take a look. And it says habitat loss is probably the greatest threat to the variety of life on this planet today. It is identified as a main threat to 85% of all species described in the IUCN's Red List, so those species that are officially classed as threatened or endangered. So climate change and habitat loss are actually interlinked. Climate change can cause habitat loss. So for example, if there is an increase in temperature and a change in precipitation, this can have a negative effect on the plant species because it decreases the amount of water available. This can then cause a decline in the plant species, which would then affect organisms that depend on those plants for food or shelter. Habitat loss can then also contribute to climate change. Human processes such as agricultural expansion can cause habitat destruction and contribute to the climate change due to an increase in greenhouse gas production. So the pictures below are taken from the NASA's Images of Change website. I've linked to that in extra resources. It's really cool if you want to take a look. So on the left here we have deforestation in Paraguay. So we have 1973 over here and 2008 over here. And I mean, you can see the difference. The difference is massive. It's a very obvious picture. So I would say that's at least half lost. So that there is a big example of deforestation. So another one I've chosen Paraguay again is agricultural expansion. So this is the same area, I've lost my mouse, there it is, in 1977, and this is 2008, and the difference is just massive. So if you want to take a look at those in more detail, if you find these pictures on the NASA's Images of Change, it goes into more detail with more description, so do feel free to take a look at that. I just popped them on here as examples that you can clearly see changes. So we're going to do some case studies. I think that's the best way to study habitat destruction, where you take some real examples and you have a look. So I've chosen the Atlantic forest, and the reason I've not chosen the Amazon is because the Atlantic forest I think is much less well known. We don't know, it's not so well advertised, but it's a great important centre for biodiversity, and its loss would just be devastating. So we'll take a look at that one. So it runs through Brazil, Paraguay and Argentina, and it is second only to the Amazon in terms of its ecological diversity, and it is more endangered. Only 7 to 12% of the Atlantic forest is left intact, and only 2% of it is primary forest. Now, primary forest means undisturbed by human activity, and what's left is highly fragmented. So you can see here, and I assume this is a simulation, I've taken it from a scientific paper. So you have the Atlantic forest in 1500 and in 2012, and you can see that's quite the reduction, and you've got some evidence of fragmentation as well. So who lives there? About 2,200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles and amphibians, and that accounts for 5% of Earth's vertebrates. 148 of vertebrate species are on the IUCN's Red List. 104 of those are endemic. The IUCN Red List means they're either critically endangered or vulnerable. More bird species are found here than all of Europe. So 200 bird species here are endemic, a third of freshwater fish found here are endemic, and massive primate diversity with 26 species, 21 of which are endemic. About 20,000 species of plant, 8,000 of which are endemic to the area. And endemic, by the way, I don't know why I've left it to the end to actually explain it, means not found anywhere else. So if they're threatened or they're extinct from the Atlantic forest, they are extinct from the globe. And so 20,000 species of plant, that accounts for 8% of all plants on Earth. So that's a massive centre of biodiversity, I'm sure you can appreciate. So the causes of habitat loss. It began with European settlers clearing the forest for timber, cattle ranches and to grow sugarcane, coffee and cocoa. More recent threats include clearance of forests for soy cultivation, pine and eucalyptus plantations, firewood harvesting, road building and expansion of urban areas, as well as plant collections and illegal logging. So you can see they are massive, varied threats. Additionally, river systems are also threatened by pollution, drainage and dam construction. There's also the threat of invasive species, which is where a non-native species moves into the area. Now this is a problem because it then starts acting as a competition for habitat and food resources, so already endangered native species are made further endangered. Other issues, secondary issues, include soil erosion and loss of fertile soil caused by deforestation, so that makes it harder for it to grow back, damaging it further. So all of these threats could cause further loss of the forest as well as further fragmentation. Now, I mentioned fragmentation, and it is a massive danger to genetic biodiversity as populations then become isolated from each other. And when they're isolated from each other, they can't interbreed, and that's called halting gene flow. Once gene flow is interbreeding. So once you've fragmented them, they can no longer interbreed, and obviously populations then become smaller, which is something we covered in the bottleneck. By splitting up populations, you're making that population smaller, and it could ultimately cause a genetic bottleneck. So, as the conclusion, the Atlantic forest is threatened by many different factors. There is no easy one fix. The continued deforestation is a danger to ecological and genetic diversity of its inhabitants. So, as extra work, because I haven't gone into it, is research how organisations such as the WWF and the Nature Conservancy, that's not an exhaustive list by the way, there are tons out there, are helping to conserve the biodiversity of the Atlantic forest. So do take a look at that, but in the meantime we will move on to our next one. So, plants. Often when we think of biodiversity and endangered or extinct, we'll often think of an animal of some kind. But what about the rest of life? Bacteria, fungi, protists, and plants. Now, where do you think the vast majority of our medicines come from? And what are the odds of a potential medicinal species of plant going extinct before we find it? So I've just got a couple of examples to run through that might make you appreciate how important our plants are. So the IUCN status of a Himalayan yew, and we're going to do the Himalayan Pacific yew. So the Himalayan yew is endangered. It's lost 50% in 25 to 30 years. The Pacific yew is near threatened. So why are these two important? Now, both the Pacific and the Himalayan yew contain Taxol in their leaves and bark. Taxol is used in chemotherapy in the form of paclitaxel. I am sorry, I'm awful at pronouncing drug names. It treats ovarian, breast, lung, pancreatic and other cancers. So, very important. The cause of decline, the Himalayan and the Pacific yew, is both overexploitation for Taxol. The Himalayan yew also faces deforestation and the Pacific yew faces logging. However, it's not all bad news. The future is now that Taxol can be synthesised synthetically. I just thought it was a wonderful example of a very important plant because it contains Taxol, which is incredibly important for treating cancer. Now the next one is not so well known, and this is called the Hungarian hawthorn. Now it's endangered, and in 2013 it was vulnerable, and it's had over a 50% reduction in population in the last 30 years. It is endemic to Central Eastern Europe. So you can see here, this is from the IUCN Red List by the way, that here is its extant, which means it's still going, still live in their region, and then you've here got extinct, so it's extinct from these regions. So again, its kind of population has declined, and the amount of areas it inhabits is also declining. Now, why is it important? So, recently, a scientific paper by Milenkovic et al., which means and others, demonstrated that it has medicinal properties. It has been shown to have antioxidant and anxiolytic properties. Now, antioxidant means prevents or delays cell damage. I'm sure you've heard of antioxidant before. And then you've got anti-anxiety properties. So it has some pretty important properties. And it is in danger of going extinct before we can actually study it further and potentially make use. If it's already had a 50% in reduction of population in 30 years and nothing is done, we can then assume that in the next 30 years it's going to go extinct. And bearing in mind the first paper was only 2014, we've only really just begun to understand it. So what's the cause of decline? Primarily habitat destruction, forest clearance, industrialisation and development of plantations. Other factors include grazing by animals, mostly deer, and declining groundwater levels, so it's facing quite some threats. So just to conclude this brief bit, it's clear that the planet's ecological diversity is declining, which causes genetic biodiversity decline. Climate change and habitat destruction are the two biggest threats to biodiversity. Some scientific studies have named this the Holocene extinction event. It is called an extinction event because current extinction levels are many more times that of expected background extinction levels. Organisms have to adapt, move, or die. So we've only covered some very basic case studies, so do feel free to research some of your own. And I'll see you in the next section.